He still sets the table for someone who died 10 years ago. There is a particular chair at a particular table in countless homes across the country that hasn't been sat in for years, sometimes decades, and yet continues to receive a plate during holiday dinners, a chair pulled slightly out from the table as though someone might, at any moment, walk in and take their seat. The person who once occupied that chair has been gone for a long time. And still, without fail, on Thanksgiving, on Christmas, on the specific Sunday dinners that once gathered the whole family together, a place gets set for someone who will never again sit down to eat it. The wise observer has watched this particular pattern with real tenderness, because it reveals something profound about how grief actually works for many men of this generation, not as a process with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but as something that becomes woven permanently into the ordinary architecture of daily life, expressed not through words or tears, but through small, repeated, physical rituals that continue long after the loss itself has technically been accepted. To understand why this happens, the wise observer must look at how differently these men were taught to process loss compared to how grief is discussed today. Many Gen X men grew up in an era that offered almost no real vocabulary for ongoing grief, no permission to mourn indefinitely, no cultural framework beyond a socially acceptable window of visible sadness after which everyone, including himself, expected him to have moved on. The reality of grief, of course, rarely respects these artificial timelines. It simply goes underground, finding other, quieter channels through which to express itself, channels that don't require anyone's permission or acknowledgement to continue. Setting a table is one such channel. It requires no explanation, invites no questions, and yet accomplishes something genuinely significant. It maintains a physical, tangible acknowledgement of a person's continued importance in a household's daily rhythm, long after that person's physical presence has ended. The plate isn't really about feeding anyone. It's about refusing to let an entire chair, an entire place in the family's ongoing life, simply disappear as though the person who once occupied it never mattered at all. Consider the specific forms this ritual often takes beyond the dinner table itself. A coffee mug that belonged to a late wife remains in the cabinet, never used by anyone else, brought out and washed periodically, even though it holds nothing but dust most of the year. A particular parking spot in the driveway, once reserved for a spouse's car, remains unconsciously avoided by everyone in the family, an unspoken agreement no one ever explicitly negotiated. A specific date on the calendar, an anniversary of death rather than birth, gets marked and quietly honored year after year, sometimes for decades, long after most people outside the immediate family have stopped remembering the date at all. The wise observer wants to name something important here. These rituals persist not because the man performing them is stuck or unable to move forward, as popular understanding of grief sometimes assumes. They persist because grief for a truly significant loss doesn't actually resolve into a tidy conclusion. It transforms, gradually, into something that can coexist alongside an otherwise full and functioning life, expressed through these small physical continuities rather than constant visible sorrow. A man who sets a place at the table for his late wife every Thanksgiving isn't necessarily suffering acutely in that moment. He's simply maintaining a form of ongoing relationship with someone whose absence he's never required himself to fully resolve into forgetting. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern with real emotional depth. A family gathers for a holiday meal, 10 years after losing their mother, and the youngest grandchild, too young to remember her directly, asks innocently why there's an extra place set at a table that clearly doesn't need it. The room goes quiet for a moment, adult family members exchanging glances before her husband, the family's patriarch, answers simply and without visible distress, "That's Grandma's spot. We always leave it for her." The explanation lands not as morbid or strange to the family, but as an accepted, integrated part of how this particular family continues to include someone who's no longer physically present among them. This pattern often intensifies specifically around milestone anniversaries and significant family events, weddings, graduations, the birth of new grandchildren moments, where the absence becomes particularly acute, precisely because the person being honored would have wanted so badly to witness them. Many men in this position describe a specific, private ritual during these milestone moments, quietly speaking to the deceased person as though updating them on family news, a habit rarely disclosed to anyone else but genuinely significant to how he processes these bittersweet occasions internally. It's worth examining how this ritual differs depending on the specific relationship to the person being memorialized. Grief for a spouse often carries a particular quality of ongoing partnership maintained through ritual, continuing to make decisions as though consulting the person, referring to future plans using "we," even years after becoming functionally single. Grief for a sibling, particularly one lost young, often carries something closer to unfinished business, an ongoing sense of a life that should have continued alongside his own but didn't, honored through rituals that acknowledge an entire alternate life that never got to unfold. Grief for a parent tends to manifest differently still, often through the careful preservation of specific objects or habits that connect directly to the parent's own daily rituals, maintaining a felt continuity with the household culture that parent established. The wise observer wants to point out something particularly tender about how these rituals sometimes get discovered, almost accidentally, by people outside the immediate family who assumed grief operated on the more compressed timeline popular culture often suggests. A new daughter-in-law, encountering an untouched coffee mug for the first time and asking innocently about it, can inadvertently open a window into just how much ongoing emotional labor and quiet remembrance exists beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary, functioning household labor. The family performs so consistently that they've stopped even noticing it as remarkable. There's a specific complexity worth naming in how these rituals sometimes become a source of quiet tension within blended or remarried families, where a second spouse must navigate the ongoing physical presence of a predecessor's memory in ways that can feel, understandably, complicated to process. Many second spouses describe genuine compassion for these rituals once they understand their true function, recognizing that honoring a previous loss doesn't diminish the current relationship, but rather demonstrates exactly the kind of loyal, enduring capacity for love that made the current relationship possible in the first place. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how these rituals sometimes evolve naturally over very long periods of time, shifting in form without ever fully disappearing. The place setting that continued for the first 5 years after a loss might eventually transform into something quieter, a single candle lit during holiday meals rather than a full place setting, a brief toast rather than an empty chair. This evolution doesn't represent forgetting or moving past the loss. It represents grief, finding new, sustainable forms as decades pass, forms that continue honoring the relationship without requiring the same intensity of ritual that felt necessary during the rawest years immediately following the loss itself. There's a particular irony worth naming in how these rituals sometimes coexist alongside a man's otherwise stoic, unemotional relationship to his own loss in every other context. He may never cry openly at the anniversary of the death, never bring up the loss unprompted in conversation, deflect any direct question about how he's really doing with practiced ease, and yet the ritual continues without fail, year after year, a physical expression of grief that requires none of the verbal vulnerability he's spent a lifetime avoiding in every other domain. The table setting becomes, in a very real sense, his primary language for mourning, operating entirely outside the conversations he's never learned how to have directly. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with his relationship to specific objects beyond the dinner table. A late spouse's reading glasses might remain exactly where she left them for years, untouched but never discarded. Her side of the closet might remain filled long after any practical reason exists, not out of denial, but out of genuine reluctance to complete an action that would feel like erasing the final physical evidence she once occupied this space in his daily life. These preserved objects function similarly to the table setting's small, tangible refusals to let absence become total. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how these rituals sometimes become genuinely meaningful sites of connection across generations, rather than sources of discomfort as outsiders might initially assume. A grandchild, now old enough to understand, asks her grandfather directly what he misses most about her grandmother, and rather than deflecting the question as he might in other contexts, he finds himself able to answer honestly, standing beside the very table setting that's made this specific, difficult conversation possible, in a way direct discussion never quite managed on its own. The ritual, in this case, becomes not an obstacle to processing grief openly, but a bridge toward exactly that kind of honest conversation he'd otherwise struggle to initiate. The wise observer wants to point out something specific about how these rituals sometimes shift meaningfully once a man remarries or enters a significant new relationship, a transition that requires careful, compassionate navigation from everyone involved. Many men describe genuine anxiety about how to honor a deceased spouse's memory while fully committing to a new partnership, fearing that any continued ritual might be read as disloyalty to the person now sharing his life. The men who navigate this most successfully often describe direct, honest conversations with new partners about what these rituals mean and why they matter, finding that most partners, once genuinely understanding the ritual's function, become supportive participants rather than threatened observers of an ongoing grief they initially misunderstood. It's worth noting, too, how these rituals sometimes shift specifically around the loss of a child, a grief that operates according to its own particular, often more intense rules than other forms of loss. A bedroom kept largely unchanged for years, a specific chair at holiday gatherings left permanently empty regardless of how many years pass, an annual ritual marking a birthday that will never again be celebrated. These often persist with even greater intensity and for longer periods than grief for a spouse or parent, reflecting a loss that violates the expected order of life in ways aging grief generally doesn't. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge the specific comfort many men describe finding in maintaining these rituals, precisely because they require no audience, no validation, no external permission to continue. In a life often organized around performing competence and stoicism for other people's benefit, the private ritual of setting an extra place, of avoiding a particular parking spot, of quietly updating a deceased loved one on family news offers something genuinely rare, a space entirely free from the performance he maintains everywhere else, a place where grief can simply exist, unwatched and unjudged, for exactly as long as it needs to. There's one final observation worth naming, because it speaks to how these rituals ultimately serve the living as much as they honor the dead. Families who maintain these traditions across generations often describe something unexpected. Rather than dwelling primarily in sadness, the ritual itself frequently becomes a source of genuine warmth and connection, an opportunity to actively remember rather than passively grieve. A grandchild who never met her grandmother still grows up knowing exactly what she loved, exactly how she laughed, exactly what made her irreplaceable, purely through the stories that accompany a place setting maintained faithfully for far longer than her actual lifetime, overlapped with the family she left behind. There is real tenderness worth ending on, though it requires holding space for genuine sorrow alongside genuine hope. These quiet rituals, maintained for years or even decades, represent something the wise observer believes deserves far more recognition than they typically receive. Concrete, ongoing evidence that love doesn't simply end when a life does. The plate set for someone who will never eat it, the mug that holds only dust, the parking spot no one uses, these aren't signs of a man unable to move forward. They're evidence of a man who found his own quiet, unspoken way of ensuring that someone who mattered enormously to him continues, in whatever small way remains possible, to belong. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you know a man who maintains these quiet rituals for someone he's lost, understand that this isn't a sign of struggle or stagnation requiring gentle intervention. It's one of the most genuine, sustained expressions of love available to him, a way of saying, without words, that some people's absence never actually becomes ordinary, no matter how many years pass, and that keeping their place at the table, however small the gesture, remains one of the few ways he knows how to keep loving someone he can no longer hold.